All right, welcome back to the Vietnam War. This is part two. We are doing just a brief kind of rundown of the events of the Vietnam War, and then we are going to take a deeper dive into this conflict and see if we can figure out perhaps why it went down the way it went down. But when we were last talking, Johnson had been given the permission from the Gulf Tonkin Resolution to do whatever he wanted in Vietnam and began bombings. And then troop deployment, 500,000 troops by 1967, and then you have a change in leadership. Then we have Richard Nixon, and we were about to talk about Nixon's kind of secret plan to end the Vietnam War. And Nixon's plan is known as Vietnamization. The idea behind Vietnamization is to train and equip the South Vietnamese to fight the war on their own. That you could withdraw all American forces if the South Vietnamese could handle the war all by themselves. And so between the fall of 1969, Nixon had announced to withdraw 60,000 American ground troops, and between 1969 and 1972, he rolled the American troops' presence down substantially from nearly 500,000 to about 60,000. But Nixon still didn't feel like he and his people were ready to leave the war just yet. At the same time he is pulling troops back, he also starts a new bombing campaign. Nixon decides that the most effective way to tip the military balance of power in America's favor was to attack bases in Cambodia and Laos. Cambodia and Laos are two different countries that are not actually in the war, but they were being used by the North Vietnamese in a trail where they're getting supplies down to South Vietnam called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So in an attempt to find and to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail, 1969, Nixon orders the Air Force to begin secret bombings of both Laos and Cambodia to try to find and destroy the enemy bases that are there. A little over a year later, in April of 1970, he announced that he was sending ground troops into Cambodia to clean out the enemy bases. When Nixon announced in April the incursion into Cambodia, he said that the United States had, quote, respected scrupulously the neutrality of the Cambodian people, end quote. But that the sudden discovery of the Viet Cong bases in Cambodia made this incursion necessary. 3 years later, though, when the Watergate investigation got going, it became clear that before Nixon ever gave that speech, the United States had done more than 3,500 air raids into Laos and Cambodia and dropped nearly 100,000 tons of bombs. Therefore, the April speech was a bald-faced lie. Then you have the Easter Offensive in 1972. In 1972, the North Vietnamese launched what's known as the Easter Offensive. It's their biggest push since the Tet Offensive in 1968. And it was clear to everyone that the South Vietnamese could not have fought off that offensive without American support. So therefore, Vietnamization is not working. There still isn't a Vietnamese government or army capable of independent survival. It was clear that America, if we want to pull this off, is going to have to be in Vietnam for the duration. Vietnamization is not going to give us out of it. And so we just leave. January 27th, 1973, the United States and North Vietnam signed an agreement to end the war and restore peace in Vietnam. The terms are pretty simple. They're on the screen for you. There's going to be a ceasefire. North Vietnamese would release several hundred prisoners. South Vietnam president would stay in power. North Vietnam stays communist. And then they would have a committee for reunification that someday, sometime in the future, a date unspecified, they would talk about bringing the country back together. The United States was officially out of Vietnam. Now the peace collapses almost immediately. As soon as American forces were out of Vietnam, the Paris Accords start to collapse. In March of 1975, while we have a new president, President Gerald Ford, the North Vietnamese began a full-scale offensive to take over South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese president asked the United States for help, and Ford tried to get Congress to lend the South Vietnamese support, but Congress has pretty much had it with the Vietnam War. The American people have had it with the Vietnam War by then, and so Congress says no. The Paris Accords had given the United States an excuse to leave Vietnam without having to openly admit that its efforts in South Vietnam were a failure. And so Congress was not about to go back into this quagmire if it could help it. The next month, April 1975, communist forces took the South Vietnamese capital, the fall of Saigon, renamed as Saigon Ho Chi Minh City. The staff of the South Vietnamese and the American embassy just barely got out of the country. Very embarrassed. There's this fantastic but also embarrassing photo of the U.S. officials scrambling to get onto a helicopter before North Vietnamese army could capture the embassy and take them all as prisoners. And so, the communists renamed Saigon, like I said, Ho Chi Minh City. They began reuniting all Vietnam under the communist government headquarters in North Vietnam in Hanoi. And Vietnam became a communist power. The American mission in Vietnam, which had started way back in 1945, had absolutely failed. You can't call this one a tie, folks. We lost this one. And we lost it at a huge cost. Loss of life, Vietnamese soldiers, this is an estimate, but 1.2 million died in combat. Also, countless of civilians were killed. We'll talk about that more in kind of how this happened, but civilians were targeted as well. American dead, 57,000. 300,000 American injured. The cost is $150 billion. And what did we get for our $150 billion? Nothing. The war achieved none of its objectives. It's by far the worst military defeat and worst political defeat in American history. So how did this happen? How did it happen that we lost this war so terribly? That was me drinking coffee. You can't see because I turned my TV off. Let's see if we can figure that out. So now we're going to kind of look at the flaws of the military strategy. There's really two problems here, and we'll talk about both of them. But one is a flaw in the military strategy, but the other is a flaw in our political strategy. So we'll look at the military strategy first, and then we'll look at the political strategy second, and we'll tack on to that kind of a conversation about how the Vietnam War became as unpopular as it was. I think if most people think of the Vietnam War today, the thing we think of is not necessarily the war or Diem or Ho Chi Minh or any of that. We think of the protests, right? We think of the Vietnam War protests. Some of them were protests in music. Some of it they protested against soldiers as they came back, which is, in my opinion, horrible. But let's talk. We'll finish this conversation with why there was so much backlash against this war. All right, let's first look at the actual combat of the war and why we did not achieve our mission. The first thing to note that as we're having as we're deciding who to attack, kind of terminology here, there's two different forces that we are fighting. The first force are the North Vietnamese army. These are the guys that are in uniform. that are clearly identified as enemy soldiers. The next group are called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are essentially just farmers. They're just people that were persuaded by the enemy to join the enemy. The Viet Cong often do not wear uniforms. The Viet Cong deploy guerrilla fighters, guerrilla forces. So they will come out, they will shoot, they'll set out a bomb, and then they'll retreat right back into the shadows or right back into the jungle where they come. And it's really, really hard. The Viet Cong became very, very difficult to fight because they fought with booby traps and ambushes, and of course, they looked just like everybody else. So an American soldier could not be sure that he was dealing with a Viet Cong, or who would throw a grenade at him or had a bomb on him, or they were just dealing with a villager who was not part of the army. So unfortunately, practically speaking, what that looked like was we shot a whole lot of innocent people. If you don't know who the enemy is, it makes it very, very difficult, right, to determine who your actual target should be. Next problem that we had in fighting Vietnam was that Vietnam was a pre-industrial society. It wasn't this modern industrial age where and what that means for our military is in terms of targets, right? If you have an industrial society, think World War II, the bombing strategy in World War II was to hit military bases and places where they're building military equipment, right? You hit factories and you hit fields where they're training pilots for airplanes, and they're building tanks, and these are clearly identified markers. They've got smokestacks coming out of them, and there's obvious airfields. Well, Vietnam doesn't have any of that, right? They're guerrillas living in the woods, being in secret. All they need is a small gun or a rifle and landmines and booby traps. They're not fighting with tanks and all of the weapons of modern warfare. So it makes it very, very difficult for bombing raids, for example, to have a target. Where do you bomb if there is no industry for you to hit? Well, often what you're going to bomb are civilian targets. You'll hit hospitals, you'll hit villages, you'll hit innocent people. Another important thing about the Vietnam military strategy is that the Vietnamese people, were very, very adaptable. When the bombing campaigns did hit them, the North Vietnamese just went underground, literally went underground. They created a huge network of hidden tunnels and shops and factories, and all of them were underneath the earth where U.S. military could not even see them, let alone destroy them with a bomb. One of the best examples of that is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's how the North Vietnamese supply line got stuff to South Vietnam, right? They called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was this unpaved path. It was not a highway, and it moved, right, all the time. So it was just a path through the jungle. It was concealed because of the trees and the thick jungle, and it was a tool that North Vietnamese used to avoid U.S. aircrafts because you could not see it from the air. All through Vietnam, the American military went crazy trying to find this thing and never could. They never could really interrupt the supply line from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Every time they succeeded in finding it and disrupting part of it, the North Vietnamese just moved it someplace else. It wasn't a big disruption for them. They could just simply move it a little to the left, move it a little bit to the right, and then just keep on going. And they learned that they needed to move way more stuff than they actually needed. So they would put 100 trucks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Maybe they needed only 20 of them. So you bomb 50 trucks and you think you've done a good job, when in fact they got through exactly what they needed. Now we're out of time, so we'll talk more in a second.